Hello and welcome to this first virtual sheet music interview. My name is Fabrizio Ferrari and today our guest is Richard Markson. Hello Richard, and thank you for joining us.
Hello Fabrizio.
And it's a great pleasure to introduce you to our audience today. Richard has just arrived here in Los Angeles from Mexico for a concert he's going to have in a few days at the USC. Markson is one of the finest cellists of our time. He had his debut in London in 1970, at which the Times proclaimed him a quite outstanding cellist. But how did his career start? Richard Markson began to study the cello at the age of 12 with Paul Tortelier, who actually invited him to become one of his pupils. And that's really amazing to me, Richard. How actually that did happen?
Well, I started the cello actually before that. I mean, I started when I was 8. My mother was a musician, she was a pianist, and she was determined that I should choose a more sensible profession than music. But my then cello teacher was very insistent that since this was my wish and I really wanted to be a cellist, and I was quite sure about this from a very early age, that I should pursue it. And Tortelier happened to be coming to Glasgow, which was my hometown, to perform, and so she arranged for me to play to him. And I went there with my mother, and he listened to me and seemed to say the kind of things that every mother likes to hear about her son, and was absolutely unequivocal that I should, leave school. I should come and study with him straight away. And as a sort of afterthought, he turned round to me and said, "And how old are you, my boy?" And I said, "I'm 12." And he thought about it. He's a little late, but we will manage.
It's pretty funny. So did you move actually in Paris?
Yes.
Wow. So
yes, my parents had lots of sleepless nights.
I see. Well, I believe you. Oh, that's really amazing. And so after that, actually you worked with Pierre Fournier later on?
Well, I stayed with Tortelier for about 6 years.
Okay.
And after that I began to work with Fournier. And that was a slightly different relationship, because with Tortelier I was seeing him very intensively. I was part of a class at the Conservatoire in Paris which met twice a week for 4 hours with him. And with Fournier it was a more adult relationship, and it lasted until he died. I suppose for about 17 years I continued to go to Geneva to have occasional lessons from him.
Wow. So your soloist career started with your contact with Fournier in some way? Or?
Well, I think I was always playing. I mean, I think all through my studies I was giving some concerts. But Fournier was particularly active in talking to people on my behalf.
Oh, I see. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I know that actually you played anywhere in the world. I know that you made more than 26 world tours, extending from Far East to South America. And so you are always around, and then in the mid-80s you began your conducting career.
Yes.
So under what circumstances that started?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that I think whether you want to be a cellist, a violinist, a trombonist, a flautist, or a conductor, you need to be a musician. And I think that my interest in music perhaps was stronger than any particular interest in an instrument, although I adored the cello. I fell in love with the cello, obviously. But the solo repertoire for the cello is very small by comparison with the repertoire that's available to you as a conductor. So I was fascinated at the possibility of becoming involved with so much music that
I understand.
That was a very important factor. Another factor was that I had also become very interested in teaching, and I think that a conductor in many ways is also a teacher. And I've enjoyed very much working with orchestras where I've been able to somehow make use of my experience both as a teacher and as a cellist to develop the orchestra.
It's wonderful. In fact, about the teaching, I know that you have been involved in teaching all your entire career, and you had master classes anywhere in the world. I have a list of countries here where you taught, in the UK, in the United States, Jamaica, Brazil, Mexico, Australia, Colombia, Hong Kong, Peru, Taiwan, Singapore, and India. Did I forget something?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
It's amazing. How many pupils do you have around the world?
Well, I wouldn't say they were all pupils. Occasionally, I've out of idle curiosity, I've Googled myself
Really?
and found pupils claiming to have studied with me that I don't remember anything about at all.
I understand. It's pretty funny. Amazing. And I don't want to forget also your recent appointment to a senior fellowship at the Trinity College of Music in London. That's quite an accomplishment. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And also, Richard has recorded several CDs during his entire career, and the latest ones include the complete Bach suites, the complete Beethoven and Brahms sonatas,
Yes.
with the Jorge Federico Osorio,
Yes.
and the Dvorak Cello Concerto with the Orchestra Filarmonica de Querétaro, conducted by José Guadalupe Flores in Mexico. And he also took care of our best sheet music editions, such as the major cello repertoire, and much more. You can go actually on our website at www.virtualsheetmusic.com/interviews/Markson to find out more about Markson's CDs and sheet music digital editions. So let's move on with the questions we have been collecting the past few days on our website from our audience. We got actually more than 50 questions, so we could pick the most voted ones and organize them by topic. So the first questions are about music performance in general, and the most voted one was by Matthew Ventura, who asks, what do you consider to be the most important lesson learned in your musical career?
Very difficult to say. There's so many lessons. Very hard to say. I think a theme that would run through all my experiences, the importance of being an all-round musician, the importance of not looking at music through any particular instrument, but really standing back and seeing music in a different scale. I remember, for example, Tortelier made his career initially with Don Quixote. That was the piece that propelled him to fame when he played it with Sir Thomas Beecham in England. And he actually, when you read the novel of Cervantes, the physical description of Don Quixote resembles Tortelier a great deal. He looks very much like the knight of Don Quixote. And on stage, Tortelier, who was also a wonderful comedian but a wonderful actor, on stage he actually lived the part, died at the end and things like that, dropped his bow, and was quite theatrical. But what I remember after all these things would happen on the stage, I remember coming back home, and this was in Glasgow. I remember him coming back after a performance of Don Quixote and sitting at the piano without any reference to the score and just simply going through the entire piece and analyzing it and explaining to me about the different harmonies that Strauss used and why he had done this rather than that, and how his genius had enabled him to come up with this rather than that. And he knew absolutely every single note of the piece, and he'd really studied it so deeply. And this impressed me, because whatever showmanship there was in the public performance, there was such a serious musician underneath, which is why he was Paul Tortelier, of course. But so that impressed me as being perhaps you could say that was the most important lesson about music.
Yeah, sure, I understand. Thank you. And okay, the second question is actually by myself. I posted this question, but I didn't think that people would have voted for it so much. And the question is, I can ask you directly, what's the best experience you ever had in your musical career?
Well, I have to ask you, do you mean as a performer, or do you mean just
in general,
as a musician?
Yes, as a musician.
Because I think the greatest, because I would say these are two different, I would give you two different answers. As a listener, there are just certain performances that I feel that I attended that were for me sort of unrepeatable and could never be equal again. Brahms' D minor piano concerto with Claudio Arrau happened to be one of my mentors, somebody I was very close to and that I admired perhaps more than any musician. Hammerklavier with Rudolf Serkin, when I heard him play that in Paris. Brahms' C minor symphony with Kurt Masur in the Leipzig Gewandhaus in Mexico once. There are certain performances which just somehow rather stood out. Kurt Sanderling conducting Tchaikovsky 4 in London in the Festival Hall when he was 87. I've never heard that symphony sound so wonderful before or since, and I never will. I'm sure I never will. So these were, a handful of performances that to me were on the highest possible musical, spiritual, inspirational level.
Sure, absolutely.
By people who were absolutely giants in their field. As a performer, that's more difficult. I sometimes feel that one movement of one piece went quite well. I've had enormous pleasure as a conductor in getting to know certain works, getting to know them more intimately, like the opportunity in Brazil a few years back of spending a month with nothing on the agenda except the Fauré Requiem, and working with everybody, working with the choir, working with the soloists, working with the orchestra, and just living that piece. Sure. That was something absolutely amazing for me. Last year I learned for the first time the Scottish Symphony of Mendelssohn, and I fell in love with that piece. Absolutely, was in another world with it.
Okay, the third question is by Orlando Manta, who asks, can musicality be taught?
The quick short answer is I think is no. I think musicality, if that's the word, musicality is innate. But obviously, if you have musicality, there's an enormous amount that you can do to develop it into musicianship. I don't think musicality and musicianship are necessarily the same thing, but I don't really think you can be a musician if you don't have an innate musicality.
And then we got an interesting question about conducting by K.M. All, who asks, what makes a great conductor?
Well, I'll go back to my leitmotif and say that I think you have to be a great musician.